Okay, picture this. You're watching someone make just a completely terrible decision. They are clearly ignoring all the hard facts staring them right in the face, and you can't help but wonder, what on earth is going on in their head? Well, in this explainer, we are going to step into the role of psychological investigators. We aren't just here to passively observe human behavior, we're going to completely deconstruct it. We're going to look under the hood and examine the hidden biological and deeply evolutionary forces that actually drive human self-destruction.
Because here is the real, haunting mystery we're unraveling today. Why do highly intelligent, capable people fiercely protect the lies that will ultimately destroy their careers, their organizations, or even their own lives? You know, we love to think of ourselves as these perfectly rational creatures who just evaluate the evidence and make logical choices. But when you really look closely at the data, you find a pretty dark psychological reality. The truth is, our brains are actively working against us just to maintain a comfortable illusion.
And to really grasp the catastrophic, real-world consequences of ignoring the truth, just listen to this chilling quote: "An act away from goodness." This was said by George McDonald, an engineer at Morton Thiokol, talking about the doomed Space Shuttle Challenger launch back in 1986. McDonald and his team of engineers knew that shuttle was not safe to fly. They presented the hard data, they sounded the alarm, and yet some of the most brilliant minds on the planet at NASA just ignored them, leading to an absolute tragedy. So how does something like that actually happen? To find out, we need to peel back the very first layer of our investigation.
Section 1. The Hidden Alarm System, the Biology of Belief. Let's look at what's really happening inside the brain.
Our starting point here is cognitive dissonance. The concept was first articulated by psychologist Leon Festinger way back in 1957, but I want to be clear, this is not just some vague, fleeting feeling of unease. It is a massive, fundamental biological drive for internal consistency. Think about it. When you hold two totally conflicting beliefs at the same time, like I'm a really smart, highly ethical person, and I am currently making a terrible, unethical decision, your brain actually registers a physical conflict. And the contrast between what we see on the outside and the biological reality on the inside is staggering. Outwardly, we just see a stubborn person who refuses to accept facts, but inwardly, functional MRI scans reveal a much deeper psychological truth. When someone encounters facts that directly contradict their core beliefs, it triggers a literal neurological stress response. Specific areas of the brain, the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex and the anterior insula, literally light up. Your brain isn't sitting there calmly processing a logic puzzle. It is processing a physical threat. It's sounding a blaring alarm that it feels it must silence immediately.
So why is that threat response so incredibly intense? Well, it comes down to what researcher Dan Kahan calls identity protective cognition. He argues that culture is cognitively prior to fact. Let's think about this evolutionarily for a second. For our ancestors, survival depended entirely on the tribe. If you disagreed with your tribe, you were ostracized. And if you were ostracized, you died in the wilderness. Fast forward to today, and we still unconsciously dismiss hard evidence just to protect our social group membership. The unconscious motivation is profound. Our brain fears the emotional devastation of social alienation far, far more than it fears just being factually wrong.
Which brings us to Section 2, Mechanisms of Ego Defense, Protecting the Self at All Costs. Let's see how the brain reacts when that alarm goes off. Once that unbearable internal tension kicks in, the brain initiates this sort of sinister downward spiral to protect its integrity at literally any cost. First up is denial. The ego simply refuses to even acknowledge the anxiety-producing reality. It's just, nope, not happening. If that fails, it moves to step 2, rationalization. This is where we construct highly logical yet entirely false excuses to justify what we're doing. And if the evidence against us becomes completely overwhelming, we hit step 3, which is escalation of commitment. Instead of just pulling back and admitting defeat, people will double down on a failing course of action, throwing away more time, more money, and more of their reputation on a totally lost cause.
And it's absolutely vital we distinguish between two concepts that get confused all the time here. The sunk cost fallacy is essentially just about recovering losses, right? It's thinking, man, I've spent way too much money to quit now. But escalation of commitment, that is a much deeper, entirely ego-driven refusal to admit failure. It's all about saving face. It's about avoiding public embarrassment. At this stage, you aren't just protecting your wallet anymore. You are fiercely, desperately protecting your identity.
So moving on to Section 3, the pathology of groupthink, Collective rationalization and disaster. What happens when this infects a whole organization?
When you zoom out to the societal level, you encounter groupthink. Coined by Irving Janis in 1972, this is basically the ultimate disastrous aggregation of those individual ego defenses we just talked about. It happens when a group's overwhelming desire for conformity, harmony, and maintaining a unified identity completely overrides any realistic risk assessment. That biological fear of being ostracized kicks in so hard that it literally prevents anyone in the room from speaking the truth. Which brings us right back to the Challenger disaster. This timeline is honestly a masterclass in how groupthink actively suppresses life-saving data. On the very eve of the launch, engineers presented rigorous, undeniable data showing the O-ring seals would fail in freezing temperatures. But the night before the launch, under immense political and organizational pressure, NASA managers literally shifted the burden of proof. They demanded the engineers prove it was unsafe, rather than proving it was safe to fly. On launch day, those dissenters were heavily pressured into silence, a silence that management conveniently interpreted as unanimous agreement. And 73 seconds later, 7 lives were lost. The data was all there, but the psychology completely overrode it.
When you autopsy a catastrophic failure like that, very specific warning signs always emerge. You see an illusion of invulnerability, this attitude of, hey, we're NASA, we don't fail. You see collective rationalization, immense pressure on dissenters, and deep self-censorship. There were even what psychologists call mind guards, literally individuals within the group who took it upon themselves to actively shield the leaders from any dissenting information. When you mix high stress, insulation from outside critique, and highly directive leadership, you are perfectly engineering these exact fatal blind spots.
Let's go to Section 4, rewiring the brain's defenses, overriding evolutionary wiring. We've diagnosed the disease, now we need the cure. So, how do we actually override our own destructive evolutionary default settings? While our traditional human behavior defaults to suppressing, avoiding, or rationalizing all that painful cognitive dissonance, there is another way. Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, or ACT, offers a radically different path. Developed by Stephen C. Hayes in the 1980s, I want to be really clear here. This is not some passing, feel-good wellness trend. This is a highly systematic cognitive intervention. It is quite literally designed to stop you from fighting your own internal biological alarms, teaching you how to acknowledge those difficult emotions without letting them hijack your behavior.
ACT uses 6 core processes to build a concrete system for the brain. It starts with acceptance, just embracing your thoughts without trying to run away from them. Then comes cognitive diffusion, which is so important we're going to look at it closer in just a second. Then being present and recognizing self as context, which essentially means realizing you are the observer of your thoughts, not the thoughts themselves. Finally, it's about identifying your true values and taking committed action based on them. This whole framework builds what we call psychological flexibility. You're basically teaching your brain how to juggle complex, totally conflicting realities without immediately smashing the panic button.
Now let's really zero in on cognitive diffusion, because this right here is your ultimate weapon against the brain's biological threat response. When that dorsal anterior cingulate cortex fires up and starts screaming at you, cognitive diffusion trains you to see that anxious thought as just a passing event. It's not absolute truth. You just observe it, totally without judgment. By taking a breath, stepping back, and detaching from that automatic, sweaty emotional response, you completely strip the threat of its power over you. This is exactly how you process cold, hard facts that challenge your identity without spiraling into an escalation of commitment to a terrible decision.
And this brings us to the most crucial takeaway of this entire explainer: psychological flexibility. It is the hard-won, incredibly valuable ability to adapt your behaviors to your deeply held values, rather than letting some ancient, evolutionary, emotional threat response dictate your reality. It is a conscious, continuous, daily effort to look at the data, fully feel the extreme discomfort of being wrong, and intentionally choose truth over ego.
We've spent this time deconstructing the hidden forces that drive our behavior. We've seen firsthand how cognitive dissonance, ego defense, and groupthink can lead to absolute catastrophe. So I'm going to leave you with one final, vital question to ask yourself right now. What lies is your brain protecting, and what is it ultimately going to cost you to keep them? Thank you for exploring the anatomy of irrationality with me today. Stay curious, stay flexible, and never, ever stop investigating the truth beneath the surface.